Okay. 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Friday of our long, short week. How's it been? Are you ready for a weekend? After 3 days? Maybe? Is anyone going to do anything fun this weekend? You're going to sleep? Not fun, but necessary, right? What's that? That's the best thing to do? Yeah, I think it is. Oh, that's loud. Let's fix that. Okay, so where do we leave off? Okay, yesterday was kind of our first quote-unquote real day of social justice, right? And we talked about kind of what it was, right? And we said that when we're approaching things from a social justice perspective, we're kind of agreeing that all people in society deserve equal access to rights and to resources, right? Everyone should have equal access to opportunities. Doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets exactly the same thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's a difference between equality and equity, and there's an important difference, there's an important distinction there. But if we're coming at things from a social justice perspective, we feel that all people should have access to the same rights and resources. Right, Faye, you with me? Okay. And that everybody deserves the ability to be able to fulfill their basic human needs, right? So food, shelter, clothing, protection, everybody should have these. But I think we all very intuitively know that that's not always the case for everyone in society, right? Not everyone has enough to eat. Not everyone has shelter. Not everyone is protected, right? And so social justice is about trying to fix those inequities. It's trying to create situations where people can have equal access to the things that they need and pursue the opportunities that they deserve to be able to pursue, right? So again, it doesn't mean that everyone has identical things. It means that people have equal access, right, and equal opportunity. And so I said that we were going to try to embrace a few broad ideas. I said we were going to take a critical approach to social justice, and I said that what that means is, I will post the slides for you later, so you can take pictures if you want, but you'll have everything anyway. So just so you don't... Oh, I haven't put it up yet because I'm a little bit behind, but I will do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, don't worry. I just don't want you to have to work too hard. Are you coming in? Yeah, come on in. Right, so we're starting off with the idea that society is stratified, right? It has layers to it, and that some of those layers, some of those differences in terms of power or opportunity have to do with people's race, people's class, people's gender, people's sexuality, or people's ability, right? And we also want to take the perspective that the way we perceive the world is not the same, right? We all have a slightly different view of reality, and so we have to be open to that, right? We have to be open to the idea that the way that I experience this class, the way that I experience Vancouver, the way that I experience Canada is not necessarily the same as the way any of you will, right? It'll be a little bit different depending on, of course, your culture and where you've come from in the world and your upbringing in your family, but also to do with your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your age. Those will change the way you perceive things, and it'll change the way that society perceives you, right? Society is going to treat me differently than one of you because we treat people differently according to the social groups they belong to. And again, I'm not saying that that's right or correct or desirable, just saying that that's kind of the way it works. And the other thing we wanted to point out was that sometimes knowledge is counterintuitive. And so sometimes the things that are actually true and accurate and correct kind of go against our perceptions, right? And the example I used, I think I've got slides on this later, but the example I used, of course, was the flat versus the round Earth. We all know the Earth is round. That's not news to anyone, or at least I hope it's not news to anyone. But we don't experience the world as round. We kind of experience it as flat for the most part. So that knowledge is counterintuitive, right? It's not, our senses tell us one thing, but the reality is actually different. And so in the process of kind of talking about social justice and social justice issues, I wanted to suggest a few things. One, that the things that we believe or value, or our ideologies, the big ideas we have about the way the world works and the way humans are, they might actually be challenged, right? We might come across information that is not in alignment with what we've been taught before. And so we also might find that our very identities are challenged. We might discover that maybe we thought we were open-minded, but maybe we aren't so much. And so when we discover these things, and I'm not saying that all of you will, but sometimes when we discover these things, we respond with a bit of resistance. And I can say that in my work in teaching this course and in other sort of social justice courses I've taken at university, all of these things have happened to me. And so my ideologies have certainly been challenged. Maybe not so much, well, a little bit my beliefs, not so much my values, but definitely my ideologies were challenged. My identity was challenged, so who I thought I was a little different than who I turned out to be. And the more you pay attention to it, the more you notice when you're not being open-minded. And so again, maybe we'll kind of encounter this as we go through the course, but I just wanted to mention that sometimes when people talk about social justice issues and oppression and privilege and inequality, people can have resistance to these ideas, and that's okay. Because again, a lot of the ideas that we might encounter in this course are connected to things that are very kind of deep within culture, right? So they're in the bottom layer of the iceberg. They are things that we very deeply believe in terms of how the world is, or how people are, or how people should be. And when you challenge these sort of deeply held ideas, people have emotional reactions to them sometimes. And sometimes people can respond in a number of different ways. People cannot want to talk about it, and they can withdraw. Sometimes people can feel guilty. I felt guilty a little bit. Sometimes people can feel hopeless or hopeful. Sometimes people get kind of angry and they push back against ideas that are challenged. And again, some of that's okay. And again, I've seen it in classes that I've been in, not in this class, but classes where I was a student. I've seen that happen. I've seen people push back. I've seen people not want to engage. I've seen people, sort of argue with the teacher and the professor, and all of that is kind of okay. Those are all kind of natural reactions to some of this material. Because people tend to do that when they encounter information that is different than what they already believe, and especially when they really believe it very deeply. It can be unsettling, and people tend to push back against it. And this is kind of especially true if we see ourselves as someone who is supportive of social justice, and if we think we're kind of living a life that supports equality, sometimes if we're exposed to ideas that suggest that we aren't, people can be, it can be upsetting. And again, I say it because it happened to me. It was upsetting to learn some of the things I now know, but that's okay. I'm not upset about it anymore. But here's what we're going to try and do in this class. We're going to remember 5 things. Do I have I have the list here, and I'll explain them really quickly. They're no big deal. We're going to strive for intellectual humility, and I'll talk about that in a second. We're going to try to recognize the difference between informed knowledge and opinion, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later today, or a little later today. We'll let go of personal anecdotal evidence and look at broader social patterns. That's something I'll try to bring back a number of times in this course, but I'll explain it in a second. We'll try to notice our reactions. So we're going to try and pay attention to how we feel when we talk about things or when we hear about things. Because those kind of defensive reactions are important, okay? And I'll talk about it in a minute. And we want to recognize how our positionality informs our perspectives, okay? So we want to pay attention to the fact that the social groups that we belong to will change how we see some of this material, okay? And again, I'll try and point that out as we go. So, intellectual humility. First of all, in social sciences, sometimes people think about things like sociology and anthropology and social justice and women's studies and things like that as kind of soft, foofy, it's not hard science, right? It's not science and technology kind of stuff, right? And so people tend to roll their eyes and think it's a bunch of, talky stuff, but it's not true. Disciplines like sociology and anthropology, this class comes from kind of a sociology perspective mostly. These are scientific just like anything else, because scientists have to create arguments, right? They have to demonstrate their findings and argue them with other scientists. And so sociology is no less scientific than physics or astronomy or genetics, right? It's a different field of study, but the principles are the same. You have to argue your case with your academic peers in order to have your views accepted, right? And so, again, we have to be ready to listen to those arguments and accept them if they make sense to us, and even if they sometimes challenge our own experience and our own intuition, okay? 2, this is what we'll talk about a little bit later today. Recognize the difference between informed knowledge and opinion. So lots of people have lots of opinions. And so if you go on Twitter, for instance, you'll find all kinds of opinions, because opinions fit really well into, is it 140 characters now, or is it 200 and, how many characters do you get in Twitter if you tweet something? You used to get 140, and then they expanded it to 180? Okay, I'm going to say 180. Nobody knows. Opinions fit really well into 180 characters, but opinions are really not that useful. Number one, and we'll talk about this shortly, opinions are statements of belief, right? So people are saying, this is what I think, this is what I believe, but they don't really give you any evidence or reason to believe it as well. And so you can't kind of use your critical thinking skills with opinions, because there's really nothing to evaluate. There's nothing really to look at. The other thing is that when people express their opinions, they're usually not thinking critically themselves. They're usually just rehearsing what they already believe, right? They're just saying again what they already think they know. And it's not to say that their opinions are wrong or invalid. It's just that they're not really useful for critical thinking. It's just people kind of expressing their beliefs, whether they're right or wrong. And so we want to pay more attention to informed knowledge, right? We want to pay more attention to argument. We want to pay more attention to things that are backed up by actual data, right? By actual science. Yeah, it's very, it's very, it's very easy to confuse these two, facts and opinions. But opinions are not really very useful, at least not in an academic sense, okay? Yeah, so expressing our opinions just kind of rehearses what we already think, but we have to learn to be a little more critical about things. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Everyone has the right to their opinion, of course, but just because someone has an opinion doesn't mean we have to believe it, or doesn't necessarily mean that they're right. 3, oh yeah, this is a good one. We have to sort of let go of our personal anecdotal evidence and look at broader social patterns. Do you know, what's an anecdote? Do you know what?
Short story?
Yeah, it's a little story, right? It's a fancy word for a little story. And usually anecdotes are personal. So, you know, an anecdote would be like, oh, guys, you'll never guess what happened to me on the SkyTrain this morning. Blah, 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 right? And so that would be a little anecdote. Something crazy happened to me on the SkyTrain and I'll tell you about it, right? Little anecdote. But even though those little anecdotes are fun to share with people, sometimes we get a laugh out of them. We exchange little anecdotes with people we know all the time, don't we? Right? We do that all the time. Guess what happened to me? You'll never guess what happened in class. You know, this crazy thing happened. We exchange these little anecdotes all the time, but they are not really useful for identifying social justice issues because they're kind of very limited perspective, right? Just because one thing happened to us this one time doesn't mean that that's the broader pattern in society, right? So we want to pay attention to what's happening in larger groups of people because our personal interactions may not reflect that, right? The sample size is too small, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Yeah, anecdotes are little stories, short little stories. 4, we want to notice our own defensive reactions because these are entry points for gaining self-knowledge. And so when you encounter something that when you encounter some sort of information or knowledge or opinion that, you know, you get a kind of an emotional reaction out of or you get annoyed about, that's usually where that piece of information is kind of bumping into something you already believe, right? And it's in conflict with it. And that's okay, but that little emotional trigger is a good time to sort of reevaluate why you believe what you believe or why you think you know what you know. And again, in many cases, you don't really have to change your mind, right? So, sorry, Trump, I'm going to reference him again. We don't need to hear his name anymore, but I'm going to say it anyway. Lots of the things he says get a little emotional reaction out of me, right? And again, that doesn't mean that I need to change my mind on anything. It's just notice that I have values and beliefs that are in conflict with what he's saying, right? And of course, that's because what he's saying is bonkers. But but it's a good opportunity for me to think about why I believe the things that I believe, right? And so we may sort of encounter some instances like that in this class where we hear things that are kind of in conflict with what we already believe. And again, that's okay. We just have to, instead of immediately pushing back against it, to think about why we're feeling that way and how we know what we think we know. Yeah. And then the last one is positionality, and we've talked about that a little bit yesterday. Our experience of society is partly informed by who we are, right? Because of course we are going to look at society through our own lens, right? And so if you're a man or if you're a woman, you're going to kind of look at society differently because you've been raised differently. You've been raised as a man or a woman. But also society is going to treat you slightly differently depending on who you are as well, right? So we have to remember that who we are is going to influence who we are is going to influence how we perceive society. And so how I see something might not be the same as the way that you see something. And that's okay, right? We're both looking at the same thing from a different angle. And the more perspectives we have, the better we can see something, right? So a teacher of mine once did this. So this is a Kleenex box, right? How many sides of the Kleenex box do you see?
4.
You see 4? 2 or 3? Okay. So depending on who I ask, there's 2 or 3 or 4, right? So obviously there are 6 sides to this box, right? But none of you can see the whole thing, right? And certainly none of you can see the side that I can see, right? So who's right? Who's looking at the Kleenex box the right way? All of you, all of us are, right? But we're all seeing slightly different things. And so instead of saying my view of the Kleenex box is correct, you're all wrong, what I'm going to say is that if we all share what we see, then we have the full picture, right? Then we can see the whole Kleenex box. So nobody's looking at the Kleenex box right or wrong. We're just seeing slightly different things because of where we are, right? And if we can listen to other people's perspective, then we can see the whole thing, right? Or most of the whole thing. What's that? Or you can just rotate it, yes. So if you can rotate reality, then you can see it all. Let me know once you figure out how to do that.
That's why they said, like, don't judge the cover, no, the book by its cover.
A little bit, yeah. It's the same thing, yeah, because you can't see what's inside the book from the outside, right? Exactly.
Was that, like, is that right thing?
Yeah.
Like, if I told you, like, there's some people, like, they are very good people, like, in this country, would you believe this? Even if you're not seeing it?
Well, would I believe it if I didn't see it? Well, I think that's the point, is that everyone has a slightly different perspective on things.
Yeah.
And so my perspective isn't all right, and neither is yours. But if we put them together and talk about them, we can see more together.
Like the religion, like when my parents like teach me about the religion, even other religions too. So I told them like I didn't see it, like I didn't see the prophets, like how I can believe it.
Right.
And it's the same thing. I still challenge this stuff, but yeah, I think it's the same way you're saying.
Yeah. Very, very similar. Yeah. Yes, but we'll come back to that. Okay. Right. So these are the 5 things we're going to try and do. We're going to strive for intellectual humility, right? We're going to be open to the fact that we might not know everything. We're going to talk a little bit more today about informed knowledge and opinion. We're going to remember that our personal experiences are certainly valid for ourselves, but they might not reflect broader social patterns, okay? Maybe a quick example I'll give you of this is that, here's a question for you. Does racism exist in Canada? Is there racism in Canada? Really? Well, I know that to be true, and it is true. But from my own personal perspective, I don't experience any, right? People are not racist toward me. Is that surprising? What's that? Well, not so much, right? Because racism tends to be in Canada directed at non-white people. So it's not surprising that I'm not the victim of racism, because that's usually not the direction that racism is moving in Canada. It's usually moving towards non-white people. So for instance, it would be very easy for me, and some people have said, well, you know, we don't have a problem with racism in Canada. The US, oh, they have problems, but Canada, we're okay here. And again, that's very easy to say for a white person who's not on the receiving end of racism. But when a white person says that, non-white people in Canada kind of roll their eyes and say, yeah, there is racism in Canada. And so even though I might not have experienced racism personally directed at me, it still exists. I know it's here. And again, if I, do some reading or look on social media, I can find it. But again, my personal experience is not of that, right? Yeah, so defensive reactions are a good entry point for examining our own beliefs. And again, our positionality will influence how we see things and how we understand things. Oh, and I've got one more slide too. Whatever could I have said here? Oh, right. I think we all kind of know this, but when we're discussing complicated ideas or when we're kind of debating them, we want to make sure that if we disagree with something, you want to disagree with the idea, right? You don't want to attack the person. And so this is something that I threw in here because I think that we are, particularly in social media, people are really bad at this, right? They're really bad at attacking an idea, and instead they turn around and they attack the person themselves, right? And so that's kind of bad critical thinking. That's bad conversational etiquette. Don't attack the person, attack the idea, right? If you don't agree with something, then it's the idea that needs to be debated, not the person. But again, in media and in social media, people are very bad at this, and they just attack each other, right? And when you just start attacking each other, you can't resolve anything. You can't have a conversation. So yeah, so even though I might disagree with something President Trump says or does, I really shouldn't attack him. I should attack the idea. Although I might do both. But I shouldn't. But yeah, so be nice to each other. It's okay to disagree, but don't attack anyone. Okay. We're going to get to critical thinking in a minute, but first I want to talk about critical theory, okay? So critical theory is a complicated thing, and so we just need to take a little sort of section off the top of it to know what we're talking about. We don't need to dig too deeply into it. But critical theory is, the two things we'll need to know about critical theory is these two things. So one, acquiring new information may challenge our common sense, and I know we've kind of mentioned that already. And the second one is that we need to think about the meaning that is given to information, okay? And this is a particularly important one because I think that most of us are taught to see information as neutral, right? As unbiased, as just a fact is a fact, right? That's it. But I'm going to try and convince you that there's actually more to it. Information carries social and political meaning with it. And so what you know, how you know it, and the reason you know it in the first place are all connected to social and political meanings in society, okay? So information is not neutral. It is, biased is not the right word, but it does carry meaning with it, okay? So let me explain these two things here. One of the things we encounter in school often is the idea that knowledge is absolute, right? That it's unchanging, that a fact is a fact forever and ever and ever, right? But again, that's not true. Our knowledge is not absolute. Human knowledge is changing, right? The things that we thought to be true 100 years ago, we no longer think to be true, right? So we learn new things, we get new perspectives on things, and so knowledge evolves, right? Knowledge changes. And so the things that you know, the things that we know right now, is very dependent on when and where we are living, right? And so the way we look at things, the things that we know, depends on where and when we are. If we go back 100 years, we will not only know different things, but we will see that information differently. We'll understand that information differently. Let me give you an example. Oh, the flat Earth we've talked about, right? So Europeans once thought that the Earth was flat, right? If anyone knows the history of science in Western Europe, you'll know that people thought the Earth was flat for quite some time. And then Renaissance scientists sort of stepped forward and said, hey, look, we've done some experiments, and the experiments seem to suggest that the world is round, right? And these early scientists had to work very, very hard to convince European society and the Roman Catholic Church that in fact the world was round, right? And so part of the reason why it was so difficult to convince people had to do with social and political control. And so the Roman Catholic Church, who was very powerful in European society, they had been saying for quite some time that the Earth was flat, because kind of in pre-Renaissance Europe or pre-Enlightenment Europe, if you had a question about the way the universe worked or the nature of reality, you went to the church, right? You went to the priest, and the priest told you how it was, right? And so knowledge came from up there, right? Came from God and came through the church. But as the Enlightenment sort of proceeds and the Renaissance proceeds and science proceeds, people start to stop looking up there for knowledge and start to look around here, right? How can we observe the world and figure out how it works on our own? And so these sort of Renaissance scientists do just that. They conduct experiments and they say, hey guys, I think the world is round. But the church fought very hard against that idea because, of course, if the church was wrong about the flat earth, what else might they be wrong about? Might people question their teachings? Might people question their authority? Might they lose power if people stop believing in the church because, oh gosh, they were wrong about the flat earth. What else are they wrong about? And so the shape of the earth and its place in the solar system, right? Because earlier models of our solar system had the sun revolving around the earth, right? Not the earth revolving around the sun. So the shape of the earth has social and political meaning. It's not just a fact. And so in this time and place, in sort of Renaissance Europe, there were political meanings attached to that flat earth idea, right? Now, surprisingly, wow, I'm getting a lot of emails. Surprisingly, there are people who still believe that the earth is flat. And so if you go online and you Google flat earthers, you will find a collection of people, I think they're mostly American, which might not surprise you, but mostly American, who still believe the world is flat, okay? Even though, of course, we have pretty significant scientific evidence that shows that the earth is round. There are experiments that you can do on your own to see that roundness, but they still disagree.
Like, who's these people? Are they not educated?
Exactly, who are these people and why do they believe this, right? Well, I won't show it to you, but in earlier versions of this class, I had a short video where you could see what these people were saying. But interestingly, what they're saying is they're not really challenging the science. And so they're not kind of thinking critically about round versus flat earths. Their beliefs have more to do with meaning, with social meaning. And so what the flat earth people say, if you interview them, is that it has to do with the kind of the meaning of their existence, right? So because the idea of the round earth is a scientific idea, it's connected to all kinds of other scientific ideas too, right? It's the idea that, okay, well, the earth is round and the earth is kind of revolving around the sun, and we're part of this huge galaxy which is, you know, set in an infinite universe of other galaxies. We're just a tiny little speck in the vastness of space. We're flying through space at 1,000,000 miles an hour. You know, we've life has evolved on this planet seemingly by accident, and evolution has kind of progressed in its own way. We're kind of here because we've evolved this way, and that's kind of the scientific view. And people who believe in a flat Earth kind of feel that there's no meaning attached to that, right? Like, who are we? We're just little, primates that have evolved on a little speck of nothing in the vastness of space. That's a little bit of a scary idea, right? And there's, it's easy to question, like, well, what is the meaning of my existence, right? One of 7.5 billion people on this tiny little speck in the middle of nowhere. What is the point of my life, kind of thing? And so the flat earthers feel that they don't really enjoy that kind of feeling or that kind of meaning. And so they feel that a flat earth is more in alignment with a created universe, right? Maybe a creator, a God who has created us all and has put us here, and there's a purpose to our lives. And when we die, that's not the end. We'll actually have something after that. That's a more, I think, comforting and meaningful idea for them. And so they have kind of latched on to this idea of a flat earth, not because they're so much interested in the shape of the earth, but because of the meaning it's connected to. And it's the idea that a flat earth is connected to a created world, a created universe, and the idea that we're all here for a purpose because some sort of creator God has put us here, right? And that's a much more comforting thought than the scientific explanation, which is, there's no meaning to anything and who knows why we're all here, right? So even though their belief is false, right, that the earth is not flat, you can see why they're hanging on to it, right? Because it has to do with a social meaning, and they don't enjoy the social meaning that is connected to the scientific explanation, right? So I also wanted to use this opportunity to talk about conspiracy theory. Has anyone heard of conspiracy theory or a conspiracy theory? Yeah, if you're paying any attention to the news, you will have heard about conspiracy theories. What would you say, what is one? What is a conspiracy theory? Okay, so it might have to do with aliens in Area 51, right, in New Mexico. What else? Either conspiracy theories or just what a conspiracy theory is.
Something that doesn't have evidence, but people speculate about it.
Right.
Come up with theories and how that worked out.
Yeah, so something for which people don't have evidence, but they have created some sort of explanation for it. Yeah, what else? Or do you know of any conspiracy theories? No? There's tons of them out there. Have you heard of QAnon? Nobody? Maybe I'll bring them in later. So conspiracy theories are this. They're basically what you said, Avera. So they're explanations of an event or a situation that involves a conspiracy. So people are, sort of meeting behind the scenes, right? So these kind of evil and powerful people or groups, and they are sort of in control of things, okay? But nobody knows, right? There's no evidence for it. And so conspiracy theories are a problem because, like Avera mentioned, they usually don't have any evidence attached to them, right? So there's the aliens at Area 51. There's no evidence that aliens were ever there, right? There's some pictures. We don't know if they're fake or not. The government's not saying anything. We don't know. And so some people have gone to great lengths to create a narrative, create a story about why the aliens crash landed there and why the government is keeping it secret and what might happen as a result. But there's no evidence for any of this stuff. And conspiracy theories kind of continue to operate because they work on circular reasoning. And we can talk about this a little bit more in our critical thinking. But with circular reasoning, the thing you're trying to prove is proved by the thing itself. Okay, and so there's no kind of way out of it. And so with conspiracy theories, often they are proved, and I'm going to put quotes around proved, they are proved by the fact that there's no evidence, right? So a very classic conspiracy theory that still floats around but was very heavily used in Nazi Germany was the idea that Jewish people were secretly in control of the world, okay? And this is still a conspiracy theory that exists. And so the idea is that somehow Jewish people are, secretly controlling the world from behind the scenes and nobody knows. And so, of course, the question is, well, what is the evidence for something like this? And it's like, oh, well, there isn't any, because of course if there was evidence, then people would know and then they would lose their power. And so you can't find your way out of the loop, right? The thing that proves that it's happening is the fact that there's no evidence for it at all. And so you're kind of stuck in this loop where you can't get out. You can't disprove it because having no evidence to these people proves that it's true. You know what I mean? Yeah, so you get stuck, right? You can't reason your way out of this sort of circular logic. And so there's lots of conspiracy theories floating around. Again, I'll use President Trump. President Trump likes to throw them out here and there, trying to confuse people. But of course, he never has any evidence, right? And he'll talk about a deep state. He'll talk about a plane full of people coming to the Republican National Convention to cause trouble. He'll talk about all sorts of things, but they have no evidence, right? There's nothing to suggest that we should believe them. Do I want to talk about this? Okay, whoops, okay. I'll talk about it really quickly. I think conspiracy theories are often a response to fear. When people don't know what's going on or they can't understand why something is happening, it's easier to suggest and believe in an explanation, even if there's no evidence for it. Because then at least you think you know what's going on, even though you don't. I just put that in there for, yeah, okay.
Or because they believe that they are wrong, whatever they have idea, but they do this conspiracy theory to not look wrong in front of a lot of people.
It's true, yeah.
So this is,
Yeah, it gives you, it makes you feel intelligent, right? Or like you know things. Yeah. And I think it's easier sometimes to believe in the conspiracy theory than to admit that you don't understand what's going on.
because there's a group, they know that this group they are right from what they have from idea, but they know, and they're like in themselves, they know they are wrong, but they want to do this conspiracy.
Yeah. And
So,
yeah, and the conspiracy theory is often easier to understand in terms of good and evil, right? Whereas in most cases, the world is not like that. It's much more complicated. Nobody's entirely good. Nobody's entirely evil. And yeah, sometimes things are just much more difficult to explain, and the conspiracy theory sometimes seems a little easier to deal with, right?
And the Bigfoot and these things, they're like part of these theories, right?
Yeah,
Because people believe, but there's no really evidence of them.
I think a conspiracy theory has more to do with sort of political events and sort of why the state of the world is the way it is. Things like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster. I don't think they're conspiracy theories so much as they are myths or legends or things like that. I mean, if Bigfoot exists or if he doesn't really change the way the world works, unless you have Bigfoot are actually humans that have been experimented on by the American government because they're trying to turn everyone into Bigfoots because then they could rule the world, or I don't know. That would be a conspiracy theory. But the Bigfoot itself is just kind of a myth.
do you think what's happening in the world now is conspiracy theory and people that we don't know?
Define what you mean by what's happening in the world. No. I think every country, I think you have a global system made up of countries and corporations, because corporations are in some cases more powerful than countries. Everybody has different levels of money and power. Everyone is acting in their own best interests. And the fact that the world is so complicated, sometimes it's hard to understand why things are sort of happening the way they are. But I think basically you just have a very complex system where everyone is just acting in their own best interest, and it's difficult to get your head around because it's so big, right? Okay, who's this guy? Any ideas? No? It's not. It's not a woman, it's a guy. Oh, nailed it. Good. This is Christopher Columbus. Now, who is Christopher Columbus? Say that one more time, but not all at the same time. Guy who found America? North America? That's him. That's the guy, right? So he did 4 voyages across the Atlantic. I think he's Portuguese originally, but he sailed from Spain. The Spanish kings and queens gave him the money to sail, but I think he's Portuguese. And he's looking for a route to India ultimately, right? Because there's all kinds of trade going on between Europe and India. There's all kinds of money to be made. But if you know anything about sailing, you'll know that really the only way to get to India in this period is to go around the bottom of Africa. Sorry, I'm doing it backwards for you. Around the bottom of Africa and then up to India. But if you go around South Africa, it's a super dangerous place to sail, and lots of ships go down. They lose, sailors, they lose ships, they lose money. And so people are wondering, is there another route to India? And of course, if the world is indeed round, in theory, you should be able to sail west from Spain and bump into India, right? That's a reasonable thing. But of course, that's not really what happens, right? Christopher Columbus sails west, bumps into something that he thinks is India, calls all the people that are here Indians, which of course they're not, but the name sticks. And it slowly dawns on him, of course, that he hasn't found India, but he's found something that the Europeans didn't know about. What's that? Did Columbus think the Earth is flat or round? What do you think?
Flat.
He thinks it's flat?
Because as you said, he traveled west.
Oh no, it's round. It's round.
But it's interesting. The idea of the flat Earth is connected to his story, though, is it not? Yeah. So the idea of the flat Earth is connected to his story. And it's a good question about what he knew, right? Of course, if the Earth was flat, I think it would be suicidal to sail west because you just fall off the edge, right? That'd be a crazy thing to do, wouldn't it? But he, nonetheless, sails west, bumps into North America, discovers it, and then sets in motion a colonization of North and South America, which of course leads us to where we are today, right? Oh yeah, so I've got this nifty little map. Pretty basic, right? But this is 600 years ago or so. And so this was the extent of the world that people knew. And so again, if you wanted to get to India, which I think this is India, you had to sail around here. And again, this is a really dangerous spot. Lots of ships go down. And so Europeans are looking for a safer way to get to India. And so, of course, huh?
Can they just go from that to the side?
Say again?
Can they just go from that other side?
Like upwards? I think they're aware of the ice up here. I think they're aware that it's impassable. I think. Right. So Columbus sails in ships that kind of look like this. There's 3 of them. The Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria, I think. 3 ships that look like this, and of course he gloriously arrives, probably not this glorious, he gloriously arrives on the shores of the New World, quote unquote, and discovers it, right? And kind of sets forth a new period of history. Okay, want to take a little break? Okay, let's take 10, and when we come back, we'll continue this sort of Columbus story, okay? Because there's much more. Okay, people, ready to go? Ready, ready, ready? Okay, so far we've established this guy here is a Mr. Christopher Columbus, right? We know that in 1492 he sailed the ocean blue. That's the rhyme that school kids use to remember that one. And looking for a passage to India, he bumps into North America. Actually, I think kind of Central America. Nobody knows where he hit land originally, but I think it's the island of Haiti or Dominican Republic is where they think he arrived first. So he didn't really arrive up here. So the story of Columbus, right? It's one that I think we all kind of know. He sails off, he sets off, he encounters this new world. And in most of the stories, he is kind of portrayed this way, right? He's portrayed as kind of he's a brave, heroic explorer, as kind of a founding father of, you know, the nation, certainly in North America, right? So Canada and the US are really only exist as countries because this guy discovered the new world, right? Yeah, he's seen as the discoverer of the new world. He's the founder of North American countries. In the US, there's a holiday named after him, right? There's Columbus Day, which is, when is it? I feel like it's in May, but I'm not sure. We don't have it in Canada. We don't celebrate it. But in the US, he has his own holiday. He has Columbus Day. There's lots of statues. When is it? Oh, October 12th. Okay, sorry. May. Huh? Yeah. In the US, it's a thing. In the US, it's a thing. Not up here. He has his own holiday. There's lots of statues to Columbus all over the place. Part of his story is also the round earth idea, right? He proved the world was round because, of course, he set off and didn't fall off the edge of the earth. His voyage? I'm going to say about a couple of months to get across, but I'm not sure. Do you have it in front of you? Oh, okay. I was wondering if you were testing me. Yeah. Oh, there we go. I had it right there. So he does have his own holiday in the U.S. anyway, not up here. But if we look at this story from a critical theory perspective, then we'll be looking for the social and political meanings attached to the Columbus story, because the Columbus story isn't just a collection of facts, right? It's a story, and it's a story that's told in a certain way. It's a story that has social and political meaning attached to it. So, so what we're saying here is that knowledge is socially constructed. Knowledge is connected to the values and the interests of those people who believe in it. And so let's go here to this Columbus story. Now, what you think about Christopher Columbus to some degree depends on who you are. Okay, so there's a positionality aspect to the story of Columbus. Sorry, I've got extra things in here that I forgot I put in. Sorry, I'm just trying to transition from what I was saying to this, and I'm not sure how to do it. So I'm just going to skip it. If we believe that Columbus was an explorer and, you know, this sort of brave hero who deserves his own holiday and statues and things like that, we're kind of reinforcing the idea that this story exists outside of political interests, that it's just a story. But the arrival of Christopher Columbus here in the New World, in North and South America, kind of sets in motion a number of very destructive historical trends, right? So it increases the transatlantic slave trade. So after people start to colonize the Caribbean and Central America and the southern United States, we see huge numbers of African slaves brought in to work in the agricultural sector, right? There are plantations in southern United States. There are sugarcane plantations throughout the Caribbean. And so that slave trade is kind of increased during this period, in part because of Columbus's discovery. What also gets set in motion is the kind of genocide and destruction of indigenous peoples. And so part of the Columbus story is the idea that Columbus discovered the new world, right? And that sentence is very much from a European perspective, right? The Europeans discovered it. They didn't know it was there. But as it turns out, indigenous people actually knew North America was here for quite some time because this is where they lived, right? It wasn't discovered at all. But this person arrived in their home and where indigenous people had been living for thousands of years. And after him, many, many more colonists came. And the pattern was a destruction of their cultures, their societies, their communities, their way of life. All of that was kicked off by Columbus's discovery. And so if you ask sort of, maybe not so much anymore, but in the past, if you asked North American school children about Columbus, you would hear the story of the brave explorer, right, that discovered the new world. If you ask indigenous people about Columbus, they see him quite differently, right? He is an awful person who set in motion the destruction of their culture and their way of life that they're still trying to recover from today. You could argue, of course, that, well, Christopher Columbus didn't do all that stuff. He's not responsible for, you know, the 600 years following his discovery, which is true. But historical accounts of Columbus seem to demonstrate that he was actually a pretty awful person, even for the standards of the day. The colonies, the settlements that he was in charge of, he was engaging in sex trafficking and slavery, and he was executing people, and he's, even by the standards of 1492, he's a pretty awful person. And of course, looking at him through the lens of today, he's a monster, basically. But the way we look at him depends on who we are, right? So North American school children were taught to see Columbus as a brave explorer who discovers the new world. Indigenous people look at him and say, you didn't discover anything. We knew it was here because this is our home. You bumped into it accidentally because you were looking for something else. And so it didn't require any skill to discover the new world. You just ran into it. And his arrival is basically the beginning of the end of their traditional way of life. And so this is a super negative event for them. Again, the idea of the flat earth versus the round earth. Many people associate Columbus with proving that the idea that the earth was round. But of course, he knew the earth was round because otherwise it'd be suicidal to sail off the edge. But the other thing that gets skipped is that many civilizations prior to Western Europe understood that the world was round anyway. And so the idea of a round earth doesn't come from Western Europe. If you look at all kinds of other societies, they felt the earth was round. The Greeks, round earth. The Maya, the Aztec, and the Inca, which are all indigenous civilizations that lived in Central America and Mexico, they all believed in a round earth. Other indigenous people in North and South America, round earth, right? People, non-Europeans believed in a round earth well before Europe did. But of course, because there is a story that the tradition of science and technology and knowledge comes from Europe, the stories tend to ignore these people, right? And they tend to focus on Renaissance scientists from Europe, and then they tend to focus on Columbus, right? So how do we know the world was round? Well, Renaissance scientists figured it out, they convinced everybody, and then Columbus sailed off and proved it. That's not really how it was, right? Lots of people knew the Earth was round prior to this, but we tend to ignore it because Western civilization likes to imagine that knowledge comes from the West, but that's not really true. Yeah, so the belief that everyone thinking the Earth was flat until Columbus actually proves it promotes an idea that progress comes from the West, right? That the West is the source of science, the West is the source of knowledge, and again, we ignore societies who knew about round or believed in a round Earth earlier, right? Because again, it suits the story that the West wants to tell about themselves, right? So again, I won't say that yet. Yeah, so the story of Columbus, the story of the round Earth versus the flat Earth are told from a Western and from a European point of view. And they reinforce the idea that the West is the source of knowledge, the West is the source of science. And again, if you look at other societies that were existing, that's just not true, right? Other societies were scientifically advanced, other societies had knowledge, but the West likes to focus on this because they want to make themselves seem as if they are the source of all knowledge. Yeah, and so another underlying idea here is that European and Western knowledge is more legitimate and more valid, right? Yeah. So Columbus also has a holiday named after him, right? We said October 12th. It is the 12th, right, George? It's the 12th?
Yeah.
Okay, good. He has a holiday named after him. And so why? Why does he have this holiday? Well, again, the US sees him as a hero, as a founding father, which in some ways is a little ironic because he didn't actually land in the US. He landed much further to the south. And he was certainly dead for quite some time by the time the colonies that came before the United States actually appeared. And so in some ways, he really doesn't have anything to do with the United States. But in another way, the United States exists because of him. And so the US sees him as a bit of a hero, a bit of a founding father. He embodies their spirit of discovery and bravery and sort of overcoming odds to build something new. And again, those are all true, but they're true from a certain point of view, right? They're true from a certain perspective. And is that what he actually is? And so, sorry, part of the tricky part of having slides like this is that you kind of think you know where you're going, but sometimes when you say things a little bit differently, it leads you in a different direction, and then the slides are not aligned with what you're trying to say, and then you wind up sitting in front of a bunch of people who are looking at you in a slightly confused fashion, and you're thinking, ugh, like how am I going to fix this? Because what I wanted to say is not what's up here anymore. It's kind of what's happening for me. Yeah, so I'll just sit back and say it. Our perception of Christopher Columbus, our ideas about him, and the way that we are taught about him all have to do with positionality. And so, again, if you are a Canadian or American school child, maybe not so much anymore, but 10 or 15 years ago, you're going to be taught about Columbus as the brave explorer, the founding father. If you are not, if you are, say, an indigenous person, or perhaps if you're a Black American, you may see Columbus a little bit differently, right? Columbus's discovery sets in motion a number of negative things for your people. And so here we go. So there are political ideas attached to the story of Columbus. And so the question is not whether so much the story of Columbus is true or false, because it's a true story, right? We know that we have historical evidence. He existed. he sailed off. He discovered the New World, for Europe at least. We know that's factual. But the way that we know the story, and the reason that we know it in the first place, and the fact that we commemorate this person, that we give him a holiday and we build statues to him and we teach his story in school, all of those things are connected to political meaning, right? They're connected to the idea that the story of the colonization of North America and South America is an exciting, brave thing that Europeans did. They built this country out of nothing. They survived the harsh environment and they built these fabulous countries. But again, that ignores the other perspective, right? It ignores the perspective of the people's lives who were destroyed in the process, right? And so when we hear a story like the story of Columbus, or when we hear about things in the United States about the debate about statues of Confederate generals, has anyone heard about those in the news? Nobody? Nobody? Okay, we'll come to that later. That's a question of political meaning. And so who benefits from the story of Columbus? If we believe that Columbus was the brave explorer who, set in motion the creation of these two great countries, the US and Canada, if we believe that story, who gains power by that belief and who loses power? So whose views are limited by that knowledge? And again, in this case, it's the indigenous perspective, right? Indigenous people are removed from the story. Their perspective is removed from the story. And again, we're only getting the Columbus story from one perspective, right? And so, indeed, he did do what history says that he did. I suspect he was probably quite brave. I think it would be pretty scary to set off across the ocean in a wooden ship like that with really no idea what you were going to bump into or how far you might have to go to get to India. Huh? 36 days? But again, he had no idea how long it was going to take him. And he had no idea what he was going to find. And he had no idea if he was ever going to come back home again, right? Because sailing was pretty dangerous. So yeah, he was a brave guy, undoubtedly. But there are more perspectives to this story than are usually told. And so the version of the story that you believe has a lot to do with the society you're living in and who has power in that society. And so here in North America, it shouldn't be a surprise that we tell the story and we know the story from the white European perspective, because that's who's in power, right? Those are the people who are in power in North and South America are white Europeans. Right. Yeah, so this is kind of, these are the questions that I basically just answered, I think. So whose racial perspective is reflected in the idea that the continent was discovered, right? That's a European perspective. Europe didn't know it was here, but indeed indigenous people knew very well that it was here. Which racial groups are invested in this story? Well, white Europeans are invested in the story because what's the word I'm looking for? It helps support the belief that the creation of the US and Canada was kind of a heroic event, right? That the creators of the US and Canada were, working hard to survive and overcome the environment and the harsh climate to build these two great countries that we now have. And again, part of that is true, right? The white Europeans did come here, they did work hard, they did have to fight against the elements, and arguably, well, I'm not going to say anything about the United States right now, but in terms of Canada, I think they've managed to create a pretty good country, right? It's not a perfect country, and it's not a country that has been built at the cost of no one, right? This country has been built at the cost of a number of people mostly indigenous people. But again, that's not part of the story, right? The story that we hear is the brave explorer who's sort of a founding father of this great nation of ours. Yeah, and so which racial groups may be invested in challenging it? And so, yeah, indigenous people would want to challenge this, this story because, again, their perspective isn't included. And when it's not included, it delegitimizes what happened to them, right? It removes them from the story and makes it seem like, oh, well, they're not important. What happened to them is not a big deal. This is the story over here, right? And so, but that's actually changing. And so in the United States, if you look, there's a number of states that have actually switched Columbus Day. And so a number of states don't celebrate Columbus Day anymore. They celebrate National Indigenous Peoples Day. And so it's starting to, that holiday is kind of being reimagined because their perspective is being included in the story, right? But there are also those who fight very strongly to keep Columbus Day because they feel it's part of their history, right? They feel that that's the correct version of the story. So that's really a long way of saying that the knowledge here, the knowledge of the Columbus story, is attached to social and political meanings. So the fact that we know the Columbus story and the way in which we know it has to do with the society we live in and who has power in that society, okay? If we happen to live in a society where indigenous people had power, that wouldn't be the story of Columbus, right? The story of Columbus would be of the evil European colonist who came here and brutalized indigenous people, right? And again, that's a true story too. It's just a different perspective, right? It's told from a different point of view. Yeah, so in this case, what you know and what you believe is connected to who you are, right? It's connected to your position in society. Oh, good. Okay, so far so good? So far so good? Okay. Yeah, we got time. So, one of the core competencies here, one of the points of doing a course like this is to practice our critical thinking skills, okay? And most of us have probably heard about critical thinking before, yes? Yes, yes? No? Maybe? So-so? I'm asleep? I'm watching a video on my phone? Most of us have heard about critical thinking. Most of us do it from time to time, but sometimes we don't do it very well, or we don't really pay attention to how we're thinking. And so what I kind of want to do with this section is to break down our critical thinking skills a little bit so that we can do it more deliberately, okay? So we can kind of think about what we're doing as we think about these things. Now, here's why I think this is important. If you think about it, I think you would agree that the beliefs that you have heavily influence your life and your choices, right? Who in this room wants to go to university or college after this? Oh, good Lord, why on earth would you want to do that? You want 2 or 3 or 4 more years of this? Why are you doing that? Why on earth would you go to university or college? Because what? Make yourself something better? Some. Oh, okay. So you want to apply for a job and you need some sort of diploma or degree or something, right? Position? How do you mean?
Like student different than like student like high school student different than college student. So the college student is more knowledge.
Right. So
Knows more things.
a college student knows more things, right? So you're sort of developing yourself, but you're also kind of
Experience.
gaining experience. You're kind of changing who you are. The promise, of course, is that we'll all have good careers if we go to college, right? That's the idea. Avira's kind of like, eh. But that's the belief, right? Right? Yeah, that's the belief. And so your belief that going to college will ultimately benefit your life in some way or in a number of ways is behind that choice to do that, or behind your parents' choice to push you to do that, either one, right? So the belief that going to colleges or university or whatever is a good thing and will help you out directly affects your choice to do that, right? And so the tricky thing is that some beliefs are useful and correct and true, and some are not, right? So some can inform us and help us to make good decisions, and some can actually get in our way. They can hurt us if they are wrong, right? Or if they're in error. And so the question is, how do we know the difference, right? How do we know which beliefs are true and accurate and will serve us and help us, and which ones we should get rid of because they're not helpful at all? And that's where critical thinking comes in, right? Because critical thinking is about asking us whether the things that we believe are actually worth believing, right? Should we actually believe this thing, okay? And if something is worth believing, we should be able to come up with good reasons to accept it, right? So I believe this, or I think this is correct or accurate or a good choice because of this, right? I should have reasons, I should have evidence. And again, the better reasons that you have or the better information that you have, the more likely your belief is true, right? The more that you're going to be operating from a belief that's actually factual. So what I'm going to try to do is establish a bit of a system for evaluating our beliefs by rational standards, okay? So again, I'll try to create a bit of a system for us, and we will either evaluate existing statements or existing beliefs, or we'll kind of create our own and see if we can do it just to practice, okay? And again, these will operate by rational standards. So we're going to be operating in a logical way. If you get really into this stuff, you can take philosophy later on, and it's all about logic and rationality and argument, and you can just dive right in and roll around in it if you like. But we'll just get the basic level here. Right? Okay, so critical thinking is not necessarily about what you think, it's about how you think, okay? And I'm going to say that this is an important thing, and it's probably more important, this skill is probably more important than it's ever been, okay? Because, again, with this little device here, you have all of the knowledge of the known universe that you can access, right? But as we know, not all of it is good, right? Some of it is misleading, some of it is inaccurate, some of it is incomplete, some of it is just bonkers and bizarre. And so we need the tools to be able to sift through and find the information that is useful, right? Okay, so I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit. And, whoops, I'm going to jump ahead to here, and I'm going to say this. You can only really think critically about things that statements that people clearly make, okay? So you can't think critically about a question, is there a God? You can't really think critically about that. You can only think about statements that people make clear. So there is a God. Okay, now we can start to think critically. Or there is no God. You can think critically about that as well. So what we're looking for is statements, right? So we're going to look for sentences that say something is or is not the case, right? Something is or is not true. So here's a bunch of statements, and they say that something is or is not a certain way, right? So a triangle has 3 sides, I'm cold, you're a liar, I see blue spots. All of those things are statements, right? these are also statements, right? Some of these are mathematical statements. Some of them are verbal statements. And if you look at some of these, you will, I hope, instinctively know that some of those are not true, right? And so this one, we know that's not true, right? We can agree that that's not true, right? Right? We can. Okay, good. I don't know. We could debate that one. What about that one? Is that one true? You're all good. What is the capital of Canada? Ottawa. People in Toronto think that, that this is the most important city in Canada, but that's Toronto. But as good critical thinkers, we don't want to reject anything too quickly, right? Because we don't want to just, we want to be able to think critically about it. So instinctively, we might see something like this and we're like, no, that's wrong. But we want to not rush to judgment. We want to give it a minute and think critically about it, right? Right. So, okay, I've said all that. So, man, we don't have much time left. Okay, this is the last thing I'll say because we need more time with this. When we're working with critical thinking, we're working with arguments, and not the kind you have with your parents or your sibling or anything like that, but it's where we construct an argument to try to convince someone of something. And this is a very important skill, not just for kind of information gathering and for school, but I think also for real life, okay? So if anybody in the room winds up being a lawyer, lawyers make arguments all day long, right? No, Your Honor, my client didn't commit the murder. He didn't hit his mother with a shovel because of these reasons, right? And so lawyers make arguments all day long, right? If you get a job eventually, and well, not if, when you get a job eventually, and you go to your boss and you say, hey, I want a raise, I want more money, you're gonna have to construct an argument. You can't just say, because I want more, or because I want a new pair of shoes and I can't afford them on this salary, so give me more money. It's not gonna work, right? You have to construct a proper argument. The better your argument is, the more likely you're gonna get the money, right? And if you wind up going into academics, if you wind up being a scientist or academic or writer of some kind, you will do this as well. Scientists do this all day long because they have to conduct their experiments, they have to write it all up, and they have to try and convince their other academic colleagues that they're right? They have to try and convince them that my experiment proves that gravity waves exist, and here's why I think so. And then they give reasons, right? So academics do this all the time. Journalists do this all the time. Lawyers do this all the time. Politicians should be doing this all the time, but often they don't. So it's a very useful skill, really, whatever field you wind up going into eventually. This is a very useful thing to be able to do. And so that's what we'll start into on Monday because we don't have enough time to do it today. Before I let you go, I'm just going to do attendance really, really quickly, okay? So Haneen is here. Yeah. You're in the back. Vicky where's Vicky? Vicky? No Vicky? Okay. Gabrielle is online. George is in the back. Sam's right there. Faye is here. Canon is online. Aliana is here. Adal is here. Avira is here. Zion? Do I have a Zion? Okay. Vicky is here online. I see you, Vicky. Thanks. I missed you, but I got you now. So Vicky is here. Daniel is here. He's online. Kirui? I don't know how to say that. Kirui Liu? Okay. Lindsay? Oh, there you are. Lindsay's in the back. Okay, I have a Clara. No Clara. Okay, hang on. Kang is up here. I have a Kasim. No, I don't. Maybe Monday. Kasim is here. Who else? Yukimi is right there. I have you. I have Anna right up front. I've got, where was Jack? I saw Jack, didn't I? Oh yeah, there you are, hiding in the corner. Jack is here. I have a Jia Hui. Oh, do you want me to call you?
Daniel.
Daniel? Okay, Daniel is here. I have a Agasaro. Nope, maybe not. Okay, I have a Mike. I have a Henry. Where's Henry? Henry I have. And I have a Amy. There you are. Okay, that's all I have for you. I hope you have a great weekend. Same thing to people online. And I'll see you Monday, okay?